So what are we to make of the term colonialism? Is there such a thing?
Yes, Nick, like you, I try and avoid talking about imperialism or colonialism because it connotes, as it were, a single unitary project, as if someone woke up in London one sunny day in, let's say, 1600 and said, "Oh, let's go and conquer the world." It was never like that. Empires are seldom like that. Maybe Nazi Germany was like that when Hitler decided to go and conquer Europe. But usually it's not like that. The British colonial phenomena were many, and they differed over time, and they differed from Newfoundland to New Zealand. So my view is, I think it's best to avoid talking about colonialism. There was no project. The empire was about all manner of things, from trade to humanitarian endeavor to gaining geopolitical advantage, all manner of thing. And to talk about colonialism implies a unity and coherence that just wasn't there.
And I think you can see it when you look at Australia. It's a very different type of exercise, the settlement in Australia, than earlier colonies. We like to think of it as an Enlightenment settlement. It was motivated and driven by men of science, people of the Enlightenment who had some quite high ideals. But of course, in Australia, as in Canada, as in New Zealand and the United States, where free settlers find themselves in conflict with the indigenous inhabitants from the beginning, there's always going to be issues. And you write this: when the people of one culture meet another and dominated in number and power, only three outcomes are possible. Either the dominant people annihilate the dominant one, or the latter adopts and assimilates, or the two people separate. And you say that in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or Australia, or South Africa, the imperial policy was assimilation. The belief that native peoples were essentially equal to Britons and possessed the potential to become equally civilized was the predominant sentiment in the imperial metropolis, even when some settlers on the colonial periphery doubted it. Well, that word assimilation, I know what you mean, and I understand it, and I understand the concept, but it has bad connotations for some these days. Can you explain a little bit further what you do and what you don't mean by assimilation?
Let's go back to the three options I laid out. Annihilation, separation, or what we might call apartheid, and assimilation. British colonial government policy and imperial policy was never annihilation. In my view, there was never anything approaching an intentional genocide, not even in Tasmania. And some Australian historians standing to my left, like Henry Reynolds, would agree with that. There were occasionally there were policies of temporary separation, the creation of reserves for native peoples in North America, for example, the purpose of which was to protect Aboriginal peoples, native peoples, from conflict with settlers, so that they could gradually learn to adapt to a new way of life that was coming, in particular agriculture, learn English, so that they could then play an unequal part in the emerging Europeanized society. So yes, it is important to note that in 1853, Black Africans were granted the vote in the same terms as whites, long before blacks were granted the vote in America. And in 1867, I think they were granted, Maori were granted the rights in the same terms as whites in New Zealand, and 1885 in Canada. Now, it didn't always work out as well as we would have liked, because in Canada, for example, the Liberal Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, 10 years after the vote was granted, Native Canadians in Eastern Canada revoked the vote. Why? Because the natives were all voting Tory. So it wasn't a clear upward trajectory into the sunlit uplands of progress. There were ups and downs, but the idea was the liberal idea, the humanitarian idea was, and indeed the Christian idea, that native peoples may well be relatively speaking, underdeveloped, but that native peoples, in principle, are equally capable of being as developed and as civilized as white people. And so the idea was to assimilate them into a new common society on equal terms as equal citizens.